miracles. He said these are considered karamat, right? And uh, and these are all permissible, and these have taken place prior to his claims of nubuwwah and things like that. So he answers possible objections, and he goes on to that answer remaining objections. So those are the 7 conditions which have to be met according to Abu-Din al-Iji for a phenomenon to be considered miraculous. So after establishing that, he goes on to this very important issue of kayfiyati husuliha, right? How does a miraculous phenomenon actually take place? And he says, according to his colleagues, Indana, his Ashari colleagues, he says that innahu fi'lu al-fa'il al-mukhtar, right? That it is an act of the al-fa'il, the agent who's the free agent. Again, we're seeing this, right? This is a common theme that you'll see a lot in many Ashari works, but in particular the Mu'aqib, which is the idea of al-Qadir al-Mukhtar, al-Fa'il al-Mukhtar, and it's to emphasize, right, the other understanding of God, which is al-Mujib al-That. So again, we see here that the miracle itself, how does it take place? It takes place by the free agent, meaning God here, who's a free agent, it appears at the hands of someone who God wants to establish the truthfulness of their claims, bi mashi'atihi, by his will, lama ta'allaqa bihi mashi'atuhu, right? And when God's will relates to carrying out that act. The other understanding is from again, here will be the peripatetic philosophers, and they hold that a miracle can either be the non-performance of an act, it can be a statement that is said, or it can be an act itself, the performance of something. So he says here is that Emmet Tariq, as for the non-performance of something, and he says the cause of that is, he says, injidhabu nafs ila alim al-Quds. It is the attraction of the soul, right, on being pulled to the alim al-Quds, and that's why an act may not take place, right, or the non-performance of something which will constitute a miracle. And then as for statements that are uttered, such as information about the unseen, and he says the cause of that, he said, is mamudra, which is having access to all of the unseen because of the nature of their soul and them being immaterial. And then the performance of something, al-fa'al, right, is that they will that they will actually carry out a particular act on their own accord, and he gives examples of that. So there is a difference here between even how a miracle takes place according to these 2 different metaphysical schools here. And the third topic he investigates, and which is pretty significant here, is kayfiyati dalalatiha, is how does a miracle signify, right, what it's supposed to signify, but then also he's going to deal with what does it actually signify. And so he says here, fi kayfiyati dalalatiha, he says, according to us, his colleagues here, is hiya indana ijra'u Allahi 'adatahu bi khalq al-ilmi bis-sidqi 'aqibihi. So he said it is God's creating the natural, course of events, which is that God will create knowledge of the truthfulness of the claim. So the miracle takes place, it meets all these conditions. And what happens then is knowledge of the truthfulness of that claim, right? How does that come about? Well, it comes about by God's creating the truthfulness of that knowledge in the person observing the miracle after the miracle takes place. Right? And because he says here, فَإِنَّ إِظْهَارَ الْمُعْجِزِ, right, عَلَى يَدِ الْكَاذِبِ وَإِنْ كَانَ مُمْكِنًا عَقْلًا فَمَعْلُومٌ انْتِفَاعُهُ عَادَةً. Because it is logically, rationally possible for a miracle to take place at the hands of someone who's telling a lie, right? But he says we know that they are we know that they are lying, right? And so how does our knowledge come about of the truthfulness of the claim and the falseness of the claim? He said this is by God's habit of creation and how He created the natural world here. And then he gives an example here, and he says here, and this clarifies, for example, what a miracle signifies. So he says here, وَقَدْ ضَرَبُوا بِهَذَا مَثَلًا. He says that إِذَا دَعَى رَجُلٌ بِمَشْهَدِ الْجَمِّ الْغَفِيرِ, right? He goes that if a man stands up and makes a claim in front of a massive amount of people, right, number of people, and he says that I am the messenger of this king to you, right? He goes, Inni Rasulu hadha al-malik ilaykum. And then, so there's a large number of people, there's a king present, and then a man stands up in front of the people, and the king is present, and says that I am a messenger of this king to all of you. And then ثُمَّ قَالَ لِلْمَلِكِ, and then the person turns around and addresses the king, saying, In kuntu sadiqan, right? And he goes, if I am true in my claim, then do something that is contrary to your ada, meaning the ada, and وَقُمْ مِنَ الْمَوْضِعِ الْمُعْتَادِ لَكَ مِنَ السَّرِيرِ, and he says, okay, and stand up from your normal place, from your throne, وَقُدْ بِمَكَانٍ لَا تَعْتَادَهُ, and then sit in a place where you normally don't sit. So that's something that's contrary to the norm, right, of the king. فَفَعَلَ, and then the king actually did that in response to, right, the claim being made by this person and the request. كَانَ ذَلِكَ نَازِلًا, so this is what he said, in this same manner, right, what that act of the king indicates, right, it signifies that this person, that by doing a sign, and the sign here is doing something contrary to their habit, in response to the claim and request of this person claiming to be a messenger, that indicates that this person, the person's claim to being a messenger from this king is true. So in a similar manner, right, كَانَ ذَلِكَ نَازِلًا مَنْزِلَةَ التَّصْدِيقِ, so this indicates that this person, the king considers this person's claim to be true, right? And nobody in that gathering observing this would doubt, okay, what the position of the king is regarding this person's claim. And he said this is not to be considered from the bab qiyas al-ghaib ala shahid, right, where we're making an analogy of what takes place in the observable world to the unseen. No, he goes, bal nadda'i fi ifadatihi al-ilm al-darura al-adiyah. He says rather, what takes place when we observe this is that this event, when we see the king do this, it actually provides us with necessary knowledge, right, of the truthfulness of the claim. And so it is ilm al-daruri al-adi, right, and then so that's the claim that's being made, that the knowledge that one gets from observing a miraculous or a phenomenon that's a miracle is knowledge that it's necessary knowledge coming from al-adi. It's not that arrives from the natural world and observing natural course of events here. And then he goes into some of the Mu'tazili objections, who said that for God to create a miraculous phenomena at the hands of someone who's a liar is actually impossible. And then he goes on and dealing with them and answering their objections here. It is 8 a.m. At my time. Sidi Harun, what do you suggest as the course? I mean, we can really go for another hour pretty easily, but you let me know. And we did cover miracles, and we covered what is it that a miracle signifies. It would be nice just to quickly talk about the mode of signification. It shouldn't take long, and then we can perhaps end like that, at that, and take questions from the respondents and have a discussion. What do you suggest, Sidi Harun?
Yeah, I think whatever you're comfortable with. I think you should cover what you'd like to cover, and as fully or as abridged as you'd like. I think we're flexible, so and we'll benefit from whatever you share with us. So there's really no rush on our part, unless CD Saf has somewhere to go. Otherwise, yeah, I would say feel at ease and do what you think is best.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would say let's just cover this part here of the dalala, and because that relates to his last point, and I think we can open the floor up to the next to taking. Yeah, I think we can take the questions and responses to this that he comes up with. Yeah, he really goes through a lot here. We could really spend a lot of time on this. Yeah. So the question here is: so when a miracle takes place, how does it actually signify what? So we know what he clarified what it signifies here in this section. The question here is: how does it exactly do that? And so in other words, what is the type of what is the mode, right, of signification? Is what the question here that's that we want to deal with. And there's different types of modes of signification. Dalalatul aqliya, which is it's a rational mode of signification that and this is usually talked about in books of rhetoric, books of logic, and others, even though it's not part of it. But dalala al-aqliya is, for example, an effect indicating, right, signifying that it was caused. Al-atharat al-mu'athir. Or when we see something move, right, motion indicates will, and when something moves volitionally, right, and then that indicates, that signifies to us that this entity has life, right? So that's a dalala aqliya. And so is a miracle, does it signify what he just stated here in that manner? And the answer we're going to find out is no, it doesn't. It's not a dalala aqliya. The other type of dalala, mode of signification, is dalala tabi'iyya. And so there's, in dalala tabi'iyya, there's no particular necessary relationship between between the dal, what's signifying, and then what is being signified, the matlul. However, so for example, the dilala tabi'iyya is that when someone gets sick and then their temperature rises, they get a fever, for example, right? So we take somebody's temperature and then we say, oh, you must be sick, right? So that's a sign. So the rise in temperature signifies that the person is ill. So that's a type of mode of signification, dalala tabi'iyya. But then there's another third type, which is called dalala al-wada'iyya. And so what what Al-Iji is going to say here, in the end of the day, how does this miracle signify this? As he said here, is that yeah, this is a dalala adiyya, is what he's going to end up like, as he said here at the very end. So it's not a dalala al-wada'iyya, and it's not a dalala al-aqliya, but rather it's a dalala al-adiyya. And how he states this here is that this is God, so when it signifies this, what he just stated right here. So when a miracle actually takes place, so that's the dal, and it signifies the truthfulness of the claim. But then that is done through a dalala adiyya. It's done through the natural course of events. It's not a dalala. It's not a rational signification, right? And nor is it a wada'iyya, nor is it a stipulated, right, type of signification. In fact, it's going to be a dalala adiyya, and so and that's done by God creating that knowledge of the truthfulness or the falsehood of the claim, depending on the context. So let's end with this. There's a lot to cover here, but I think yeah, we have passed our hour, and I think we can dedicate that to questions, and hopefully other things will come about as we get as we have our discussion on that. We'll end here for this session. For the city staff, yes.
السلام عليكم سيدي عمر.
وعليكم السلام.
جزاك الله خيرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Thank you so much for doing that so crisply within the hour. Like you said, there's so much to cover. I'm just going to make a few observations and then maybe try and talk a bit about some epistemic objections raised against the dalala that you mentioned, the dalalatul i'jaz. So whatever signifies an i'jaz. So there are about 8, I think, or 7 objections he lists, and then I think he lists it on page 345 to 347, and then he gives brief answers and terse answers to them. But before I come to those, I'm so glad you gave, probably the only person that we know who has thus far, given it, first of all, an entire translation of the overview, the contents of the Sam'iyat, and unfortunately, whether in English or as far as I know anyway, in any European language, there isn't anyone who's even surveyed the Sam'iyat of the Mawaqif, even though other parts have been surveyed, like in the handbook of Islamic philosophy and things like that. But so it's really, we're so glad that you did that, and I'll be using that for next week's session as well. So really thank you for that. Now I wanted to also mention a couple of things about some principles that we see here in the section. Now, one thing that we see, one principle that we see is the one that you just mentioned. This he doesn't want to analogize matters of the ghaib with things with things of the unseen with the seen, and so that's an interesting principle he's careful to mention. Another one which I think we're going to come to in relation to the objections to miracles is that he has this principle. Well, it's not his obviously, but it's from the Ash'ari, that he says that التجهيزات العقلية لا تنافي علم العادي. So this knowledge that we have of the way of things based on the customary way things are governed, or the way God has set up, with the regularity with which nature has been set up, any rational possibility doesn't negate our knowledge that is based on this in this customary way. So that's an important principle, because he's at pains to mention that just because something is rationally possible, it doesn't negate the fact that we can attain knowledge through this kind of regular way. The other qaida, it's not really a qaida, but it can be made into a qaida, and that is al-aada qadiya. So he uses a phrase, I can't remember what page it is, it might be page 3. He says al-aada qadiya ala intina. So what we regularly experience, or the knowledge that we gain through the customary way the world is governed, this is an arbiter or a judge to things. And I think you also alluded to earlier that he does mention al-ilm al-daruriyya al-aadiyya. So there's necessary knowledge that is based on the way we customarily experience the world, or the way the world is governed according to a certain regularity. So some of these principles are floating around in the background that he's at pains to bring to the fore, just so he's making the reader aware. Look, some of these objections that you're going to raise, require you to know that I have these metaphysical principles, or these gnomic principles, which I'm going to use to try and answer objections. So I think that's interesting as a sort of first observation. Some of the principles that we can sort of infer from the contents of the Mawaqif. The second thing I wanted to raise.
If I could.
Please.
No, I think you're exactly right in the sense that, because this conversation about if you are saying that that what we observe in the natural world is just God's habit, right? It's a habitual course of. Then there's a lot of objections that were brought. So if you look for and Ghazali anticipates many objections in the Tahafut al-Falasifa, brings up some in his response as well. And so, for example, Rushd, if you adopt understanding, observe in the natural, and Ibn Rushd will say arises is just self, right? Right, sophistry can't really make sense of it. Because ultimately now say that what wants to do is he said it in order to have knowledge we have grounded in some sort of principle, and for him it's the nature of the essence, right? Around the creative and however you see E.G. he brings up in this section here, screen and 45, he actually brings up the active action that Ghazali brings Ghazali responds to. If you to say that this is just impossible and necessary what we're seeing observed in the natural world, then it's very possible. And you can see here, E.G. brings all type of examples. It's possible that mountain can turn into gold. It's possible that can and to it's that all these vessels can turn into men, right? And because that's also an teleological contradiction, right? And so all of these possible. Ghazali actually brings up what he says that it's very possible the book I left in my house. I left my house and there's a book inside of it, and when I come back, the book could have turned into some boy or something like that. Right. These are all, right. And it's these do not entail a logical possibility. But so and so, what E.G. does here is that he gives his response to it as well, and it's similar to what Ghazali is saying. He says, but E.G. adds something interesting. He says, "Anna khalq al-'adat laysa a'jabu min awwal khalq as-samawati wal ard bainahuma." But then he goes to what you mentioned, which is our knowledge that there's a mountain in front of us, and it's not, and even though it's possible that mountain could be turned into gold, right? But our knowledge that it did not in fact turn into gold, that's a yaqeen. We can have certitude over the phenomena that take place in the natural world. So there is this understanding that somehow if you were to affirm that what takes place in the natural world is based on God's wisdom and God's will, and it's not based on the essence and nature of things, therefore we can't have any knowledge or certainty about what takes place in the natural world. And the Shahada and E.G. continues in that, says, no, actually, the mere possibility that this mountain could turn into gold does not negate my certainty that it in fact is not gold, it still is a mountain. So certainty can be achieved regarding all natural phenomena in the natural world. They would maintain that.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, he also mentions that one of the modes of knowing, like al-hiss, is ilm that is based on an adi, based on this customary way, this regular way the world is governed. It's interesting because you preempted a point that I was going to raise on that page just there. Now it's interesting that of course, following Ghazali and other Ash'ari, that the mere logical possibility of something doesn't lead to epistemic collapse. So we don't become psychological wrecks just because we admit that there is no formal contradiction, or there's nothing in the mind that denies something like the mountain becoming gold, but that it doesn't follow from that we have an epistemic collapse. So we can never know whether the mountain will remain a mountain or suddenly become gold, because one doesn't just follow from the other. We customarily know that objects remain as they are, and therefore we don't have to put our knowledge into jeopardy and become a skeptic. But the point I want to make, which is quite interesting, maybe Ghazali has it, but it's the response that he says to the skeptic, look, you say that how can we know if objects can remain with their natures? How do we know the mountains has become gold, or water turns into blood, or whatever it is? Now, one general response that he gives, and he calls it Jawab Ijmali, that you just read, was miracles or breaking or contravening the regular way things happen is no more peculiar or strange than the initial act of creation of the heavens and the earth. So, in other words, if indeed creation of the heavens and the earth is possible, then a miracle is even more possible, because creation itself is, he says, look, so if creatio ex nihilo itself is something possible, that is the greater miracle. It's not stranger to suddenly see a claimant to a miracle, a claimant to be a prophet, rupturing the regularity that we see in nature. Okay, if you think that's strange, shouldn't you look at creation itself of the heavens and the earth? That is even more of a miracle, right? That is the absolute miracle. So I thought that was a very modern answer, because you get that a lot in the philosophy of religion. Look, why are you hung up about miracles? The greatest miracle is God's creation ex nihilo. So subhanAllah, I just thought that was a bit of a nugget buried in there, but he doesn't develop it. I mean, he could have just hit the skeptic hard with that, but he then just moves on to talking about that we can trust knowledge from the way we customarily experience.
Yeah, I think definitely, yeah. What you're saying here, like, this is the principle that you were talking about. Al-jazmu bi'adami wuqu'i. Yeah. So just because we have certainty in that doesn't indicate that it doesn't indicate. Yeah. But then I think what he wants his project here in this particular answer is to say, holding this position that God, that this is logically possible, and the world is the way it is because God creates it that way. It's just it's not reason for us to be skeptical about our sensible knowledge by our senses, right? And he says in the najzimu, right? Because we have full certainty that a particular body in a particular place does not lead to la yamtani'u, right? Does not lead to the possibility of it not existing, right? And then he says here, this is his main point, that the ada, this natural course of events, what we know, is one of the means of knowledge, right? So yeah, he's definitely focusing on that. And I think because this is my speculation here, is he probably is aware of Ibn Rushd's response to Ghazali, saying that if we take this position, Ghazali, then this is just sophistry, because we can't know anything. And so I think he has that in mind, in terms of he wants to say, okay, you can have this position, and it doesn't necessarily lead to us being skeptical about our sense knowledge. But you're exactly right, the very first sentence, right, which is the creation of the whole heavens and earth from nothing, right? It's more wondrous, right? It's more ajab, as than this type of contravention in the natural norms. And so yeah, it's very interesting. And it's this issue is talked about in books of usul as well. But it's a very important epistemological point, right? And what is the relationship between understanding things as being logically possible and our modes of certainty, and the fact that when we see things take place in a habitual manner, that is a valid means of knowledge and that we can refer to and understand the world. Yeah, very.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, with modern scholars, I mean, they would say, they do. Philosophers do say, look, just because something is logically necessary, it doesn't lead to a formal contradiction, or even metaphysically necessary. It doesn't mean it's epistemically possible, or something's logically possible. It doesn't mean it's epistemically possible. So the two mustn't be conflated, because they're two different domains of possibility. Logical possibility is the widest scope you can get of possibility. But we don't based on what we can possibly know or rule out, based on the scope of logical possibility. And I see that here, that why are you inferring skepticism when you don't need to? You rely on your senses and you rely on ilm al-adi. So why are you worried? So that maneuver. But before I want to just rudely pick your brains with something, just before we throw it over to
Sure.
So now it's these objections here where he says al-khamisa, that here he's dealing with من قال ظهور المعجزة لا يدل على الصدق لاحتمالات. So this signification of a mu'jiza are brought into doubt, or are problematized with some objections, and he lists about 7. Now we'd have to go through all of them, but just very briefly, the few that he mentions are, for example, and they're related to epistemology. So the first objection is like, well, okay, you've got, how do we know that the truth, how do we know that كونه من فعله لا من فعل الله? How do we know the person who did the action, or the claimant to a miracle, is not an act? How do we know it's not? It could be his act, not an act of God. It could be magic. It could be, a manipulation of like the forces of nature, like electricity or magnetism, whatever it is. So that's one objection. Another objection that he mentions, the second one, is perhaps a supernatural agent caused a miracle, like an angel or devils or the configurations of the kawakib, the kind of astrological configuration. And then he lists a third objection that he says, look, perhaps some people might object and say it's not a miracle, it's a karama. And then number 4, he mentioned perhaps this mu'jiza is not for tasdiq, it's not for confirmatory purposes, it's not to establish the veracity of a prophet, but for some other reason, removing doubt or a warning or something. And then he lists sort of several others. So we'd have to go through all of them. He does give some responses to them, and I want to get your views on how you think, how cogent those responses are, because they are very, very short. He does a kind of Imam Razi on the responses. Now he lists them in detail, but he kind of, just gives one-liners, one-line sort of pushbacks on them. So these ihtimalat he lists, and you got some funny ones in there. But what if someone did copy or imitate the miracle, but the person out of humility didn't declare the fact that they did, or the followers of this claimant hid the fact that the miracle was met? And so you got these kind of objections that people will raise. So I just want to get your thoughts on that before we throw it out.
No, I mean this is typical bahth and munadara, dialectic disputation. So they do deal with they do deal with objections, and they are and which I think is important as a side note to indicate that the Islamic tradition is not just people doing taqleed of each other, and they're just kind of blindly repeating positions. They're actually engaged in a rational disputation and dialectic. It is going on. And so this is clear evidence of that. But he brings up 8 possible objections, right? A total of 8, and he gives a general answer. And it's interesting, his general answer, which he mentions here, is that what we've already established, ما قررناه غير مرة من أن تجويزات العقلية لا تنافي العلم العادي, right? Says that rational possibilities do not negate us having certain knowledge of what takes place in the habitual world. So he thinks that all of that answers all of these, but then he goes to tafsili. Then he says, okay, let's deal with them one by one, right? And yeah, the first objection is really interesting, right? And the first objection he states here is that, okay, this is, because he stated in the 7 conditions of a miracle that it has to be an act of God, right?
Right. وما مقام, yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah.
مقام مقامه, yeah.
But here he's stating that, okay, well, let's say, isn't it possible it can be the act of the person being claimed not an act of God? And he says, why is this a possibility? He says, well, it's a possible it can be the act of the person, not an act of God. Because the prophet's soul is of a different, well, is it of a different genus or not? We can talk about it, but it's different than all other souls. Only mizaj and khas, or it can have a certain temperament, bodily temperament, or it could be from a sorcerer, لكونه ساحرا, وقد أجمعتم على حقيته, and he says, he's putting this in the mouth of the interlocutor, that you've already agreed that sorcery is true, right? And then he goes to all of these different, and he says it could be something like, magnetism or kahraba, electricity. I don't know if it's fair to translate that as electricity.
Yeah, it's probably not. Yeah.
That's what we say in modern Arabic.
I know. It's got nothing to do with electricity here.
Yeah, so that's the first objection. And he deals with that saying, أَنَّ بَيَّنَّا أَنَّ لَا مُؤَثِّرَ فِي الْوُجُودِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. And I think this brings up Shadi Harun's point that, why each section is assuming the conclusions in the prior section.
Yeah.
So he said that we've already clarified, right, that there is no effective cause in existence other than God. Now, he's not going to go through the proofs because he said he already has gone through the proofs of establishing that, in the prior sections. So it just shows you how this whole book is all, like he's assuming all of the conclusions that he's already argued in his previous. And he goes, وَالسِّحْرُ وَنَحْوَهُ إِلَّا إِنْ لَمْ يَبْلُغْ حَدُّ الْإِعْجَازِ كالنفاق البحر وإحياء الموتى كما هو مذهب جميع العقلاء فظاهر، وإن بلغ فإما دون دعوى النبوة والتحدي فظاهر أيضا، أو معه فلا بد من أن يخلقه الله عن على يده. So he goes through all these examples about sorcery. And so he says, okay, if the act of sorcery hasn't reached the level of i'jaz, so it has to be incapacitating, meaning it should not be replicable, right? And he gives examples such as, right, the emptying of a sea, or reviving the dead, as is the madhab of Jamil Aqala, he's saying here, right? And so he goes through all these different examples of that, and he answers the different possibilities here. The one that you mentioned here, the 8th one is pretty interesting, because there could have been a mu'arada, there could have been a counter miracle, right? And وَلَمْ يَظْهُرْ لِمَانِعٍ, but it just didn't appear, or it could have appeared and then he hid that counter miracle, right? That the person's companions, right? أَخْفَاهُ أَصْحَابُهُ عِنْدَ إِسْتِيلَائِهِمْ. So how does he answer that? Let's see here. And he says here, وعن الثامن, and replying to the 8th objection, he says, كما علم بالعادة وجوب معارضته علم وجوب إظهاره. He goes, so if it's necessary for him to have a counter miracle, then part of the conditions of that counter miracle is that it has to be made apparent, just like the miracle has to be apparent as well. So the counter miracle would have to also be apparent. إذ به يتم المقصود, is because when that counter miracle is apparent, then the objective of the challenge has been achieved. واحتمال المانع للبعض في بعض الأوقات والأماكن لا يوجب احتماله في الجميع. فلو وقعت معارضة it's not clear in my عادة.
يستحال عادة إخفاؤها مطلقا.
There we go. It's not clear in my. So he goes, so if a counter miracle did actually take place, and it would be not impossible rationally, but impossible adatan, right? For the person to hide that mutlaqan, in all times and all places. So he goes through and answers all of these. I mean, it's really, I really enjoyed this reading, and I wish it would be nice to go through the objection that he brings here. But it's nice to see, because it is bringing up a lot of what he's already established in prior section, and very nicely the understanding of Ada and its epistemic certainty that we can have over the Ada, what conclusions that we can make over the Ada. Yeah, he goes and objections, which we can go through them all. And even it would probably be nice to, go through the establishing the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu claim to prophethood. Right? And like I said, he gives four approaches, and the first one, Wahu al-Umda, is that the Prophet Sallallahu claimed to be a prophet, and then he had miracles appear at his hands. And then, so then he established the first part of the claim is that, what about the Prophet's claim? He said that's mutawatir, that he actually made a claim to be a prophet, and it's mutawatir. And then the second part, that he has miracles to support the claim. So then he says the first of the miracles, he says, is the Quran. And this is a very long section. He goes through his pages, he goes through.
He addresses the tawatur objection. Obviously, some people raise objections about how can it be, via tawatur. He goes and he does address it at length. So
he goes
he's addressing a lot of epistemology here. Yeah.
Oh, it's all, so much of it's epistemology that's premised here, and what we call in contemporary philosophy epistemology of testimony, right?
Oh, that's right. It's all testimony, sure.
Which is very, very important. But he goes through a long section answering all these objections about the Quran itself, and then and then the idea of what is it exactly that's miraculous about the Quran, and then he goes into this understanding of the sirfa. The sirfa right here, he goes through this idea of sirfa, which is it the Quran that's miraculous, or is it that God has intervened and not allowed the Quran to be challenged, right? And for there to be the likes of the Quran to be produced, and meaning that the Quran, that there can be an equivalent of the Quran be produced, but God has not allowed for that to happen. So this is known as the doctrine of Sirfa. Sirfa was held by some of the early Mu'tazilites. Not all of the Mu'tazilites held this position. Some of the early Nizam is well known for holding this position, and what it means is that the Quran itself is able to be replicated. However, God has not given human beings the power, right? Has sarafa qudratuhum, has diverted the power away from human beings to create something that's equivalent to the Quran in its i'jaz. And so Nizam held this. Jahid wasn't satisfied with this. So Jahid was one of the Nizam students. He himself didn't hold to this position, but he held to what's called a modified Sirfa position of Sirfa. Qadi Abdul Jabbar, one of the great Mu'tazili theologians and jurists, he actually he did not hold to this doctrine of the Sirfa at all. He rejected it entirely. So it's associated with early Mu'tazili thought. Later Mu'tazili theologians did reject it. Ahl Sunnah did reject it pretty much. And so Al-Iji gives his position here, saying that وَأَمَّا السِّرْفَ فَنَقُولُ بِأَنَّ الْأَعْجَازِ لَيْسَ بِهَا. Right? Because what they want to maintain is that it's not that. So, is it like, what explains the fact that an equivalent to the Quran has not been produced? Is it because God took away? It is able to be produced, but God took away their power, such as a doctrine of Sirfa? And Iji saying no. He goes, وَلَكِنْ نَدَّعِيهَا أَوْ كَوْنَ الْقُرْآنِ مُوجِدًا. He says that, well, it is that the Quran itself is unable, right, to have an equivalent being produced of it, of the Quran itself. So the Quran itself is where the miracle lies, right? Is that there is no equivalent which is able to be produced to the Quran, and it's not because human beings just didn't have the power to. They're able to do it, but God diverted their power. So but then he's taking a strategic position here, saying, ولكن إنما. So he says, بأن الأعجاز ليس بها ولكن ندعيها. So he goes, okay, we can say that there is إعجاز أو كون القرآن معجزا وأيا ما كان يحصل المطلوب. He goes, just whichever position you take, everybody agrees in the end of the day that the Quran is miraculous, right? But there is significance to on how we explain the inimitable nature of the Quran. But there is, and then he goes into all the other miracles here. But then he goes through the other approaches, which is al-Jahid and al-Ghazali's approach. And they take a and if you read the Ihya, for example, of Ghazali and his others, he says that they established the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ's claims by his qualities before prophethood and while and the qualities of his da'wah and after he made the claim, and his akhlaquhu al-azima, his mighty character, and the rulings and the law that he brought, which is full of wisdom, and iqdamihi haythu yahtamul abtal, and how he took on many acts in his life that the bravest and the most courageous weren't able to do. So they take on they affirm the Quran's miraculous, right? Ghazali definitely affirms that, and so does Al-Jahid. But they also say there's other aspects of the Prophet's qualities that render his claim to be true. And then the third claim, which is previous prophets have all mentioned the coming of the Prophet ﷺ, and that's another approach you can take to claim to test the veracity of his claim. And then he brings Al-Razi's approach as well, which he mentions here, and then he goes into typically he'll go into objections, and then he'll deal with and respond to all of those objections. It's really interesting. I was reading Richard Swinburne's book on Revelation, from metaphor to analogy, and he gives his test, right, for prophets as well. So he comes up, he's obviously, as we know, he's from the analytic school, and he gives his 4 tests for revelation. And he's obviously, it's interesting, he's using the analogy of a human letter. And he says, in the case of an ordinary human letter, they have 3 kinds of relevant tests, right? The first is the content, the test of content, and he brings in the style, and then the second test is that of the method of expression, right? Whether the paper on which it was written, the type of handwriting, and then the third is the test of transmission. So that's regarding a normal human letter, and he applies that to revelation, right, from God, as a way of testing whether this revelation from God is, or this claim to revelation is indeed true. And so he applies the first test, and he says that the first test will be whether the content of the purported revelation is the kind of thing which God would have chosen to. The second test will be whether the method of expression is one to be expected of God, if there is a God, and if the test is to provide in any way strong evidence of the genuineness of revelation, right? It must be evidence that the method of expression is one to be expected of God alone. And I don't know if he's going to some type of thing of jazz here. It doesn't seem like it, but he's looking at the content, the method of expression here. And so that's something that, we can definitely look into. But he said there's no equivalent for the third test, in which he mentions about the human letter, but he provides 2 other tests instead. So he has 4 in total. So he goes, the third test is that the church has developed the original revelation in a way which plausibly brings out what was involved in it and applies it to new situations in a natural way. A revelation intended for all humans, which gets distorted beyond recognition, is not the kind of revelation which God would have given. And then the 4th test is the test whether the interpretations provide the sort of teaching which God would have chosen to give humans. So he provides these 4 standards, right, and 4 tests to see if a revelation is authentically from God or not. And then he spends the rest of his work, which is quite a substantial work, it's over 200 pages, fleshing out these, looking at each of these 4 tests. And he actually deals with the Quran too. But then, then he goes, spends the second part of the book dealing, affirming that Christianity does indeed pass all of these four tests. And it was interesting comparing this approach to revelation and the truthfulness of the claim of revelation and being from God, and how this same or similar issue is dealt with in the Islamic tradition. I thought it was pretty interesting. I was looking at that. I thought I'll mention that here too.
Brilliant. So Roman, if you're happy to, we can move to Q&A. See, Helen's happy with that for the last segment.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Until we hit 8 o'clock. Until we hit 9. What is it? 9 now in California? 9 a.m.
It's close to it. We have we have about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we can just put our questions in the chat if there's any questions. And thank you, Sidi Saf and Sidi Omar.